Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a series proposed by one of you, by Mr. David Solomon. And I have to thank you for the idea, because I really like the idea. What he said was, why don't you do top 10 symphonies? He said your top 10 favorites, but I'm not talking about my favorites particularly. I'm talking about the most important of their type. And that type is simply a number. Top 10 first symphonies, second symphonies, third symphonies, fourth symphonies, fifth symphonies. Let's see how far we can go with it. I have no idea how far we're going to get, but we're starting with the top 10 first symphonies by composers who wrote obviously more than one or just one. Some of them are one-shot wonders, but these are my top 10 symphony number ones, or just plain symphonies where there was no symphony number 2. I think it's going to be fun. I really do. And you should feel free to participate if you have a different list, or if you want to propose some additions to the list and tell me why you would propose them. But I'm just starting off. I'm starting off with my top 10. And I hope we'll have a really good time together doing this. And thank you, Mr. Solomon. That was really, I think, a fun idea for something, a joint project, something we can all work on. So you ready? The first one, number 1. Great first symphonies began. The history of the great first symphony began with the Berlioz Symphony Fantastique. It had to be. It had to be, because Haydn's first is important, but not revolutionary of its type. Mozart's first is completely irrelevant. Beethoven's first is good, but not earth-shattering. But the Symphony Fantastique, Schubert's first was fake Mozart. The Symphony Fantastique is an earthquake in the history of music. It is the birth of Romanticism. It is the first effort by a composer who immediately reveals his unmistakable personal voice. And I'm not going to talk about performances, because these are all works that I've done separate videos about. So you can go and look at the composer playlists, of which there are like 67 now, for all sorts of composers. And you can look at the videos I've done about these particular works or reviews, or go check out recommendations at ClassicsToday.com. That way we'll get through this list in our lifetimes, and you can do a little of your own research, because I think that's a very healthy thing, and make your own decisions. So, Symphony Fantastique is definitely number 1 in symphony number 1s, or first symphonic efforts, by any standard. And there's nothing before it that is of comparable significance. Nothing, as a first symphony. Next, Schumann's Spring Symphony, his symphony number 1. You know, we tend to take Schumann for granted because he's played to death, and he's looked on a little bit, askance, because his orchestration was kind of lousy, although it wasn't in the Spring Symphony. This was before his orchestration got lousy. Schumann's orchestration got lousy because he was a lousy conductor. And so he wanted to make his own orchestral works foolproof, because he couldn't conduct them very well. And so when he was, especially when he was in Dusseldorf, he was just a lousy conductor. And so he doubled everything to thicken the texture so that nobody would make a mistake about where to come in. But the Spring Symphony is what it suggests. It's full of exuberance and freshness and an unmistakable personal voice. And that's what we're looking for, I think, in these first symphonies. One where it could be no other composer. And unquestionably, Schumann's First Symphony qualifies. Mendelssohn's does not, for example. Mendelssohn's First Symphony is a terribly underrated and marvelous piece, but you don't hear the same unmistakable personality that you will, for example, in the Scottish or the Italian symphonies, or even the Reformation. So, yes, Schumann, Symphony number 1. Number 3, Bizet Symphony in C. I mean, so many people would overlook it, but my God, what a masterpiece it is. Yeah, he was 18 and it was a student exercise, but what is it about Bizet that we hear? First of all, tunes. Unmistakable Bizet-like fabulous tunes. I mean, Second of all, that incredibly crystalline, clean, and clear sonority. The orchestration is already totally masterful. amazingly masterful, that the joyous rhythmic bounce that his music later acquired or already had at the age of 18. Just a masterpiece. And people, neglect just what an amazing thing it was for a composer his age. But Bizet, Symphony in C. Number 4, Tchaikovsky, Symphony No. 1, Winter Dreams. Also, a tremendously underrated work. Yes, the finale has all the problems that symphonic romantic finales have. It has like a fugue that goes nowhere and a coda that's inexplicably trashy, but who cares? It's fun. And the music is totally Tchaikovsky. The first 2 movements really are magnificent. They're totally beautiful. And again, they don't sound like anyone else. And that's the point. Just from the very, very opening, when those woodwinds come in with da 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 ba da 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 da, just the wind doubling, that sonority, that's Tchaikovsky. You should be able to identify who that composer is in the first 5 seconds. And that's the sign of the composer to come. And in its way, it's a masterpiece. It's a brilliant and wonderful symphony that really deserves a lot more attention than it gets. I mean, I played it, and I just adored listening to it. It's gorgeous. So, Tchaik 1. Next, well, this one's obvious. Brahms, Symphony No. 1. You have to give Brahms props for spending 20 years working on his first symphony before releasing it, and then completely reinventing the German classical symphony, which is what he did. I mean, he really did. He was a flaming genius, and he had his own particular symphonic style. It involved a certain austerity of color. The strings always lead in Brahms symphonies. Everybody else is along for the ride as an accessory. The trombones don't come in until the chorale quietly in the last movement. And, there are solo winds and things like that along the way. But these are compositions for a full orchestra, if a somewhat subdued orchestra in some ways. Nonetheless, what Brahms was out to demonstrate, and what he does demonstrate so successfully, is just how powerful that orchestra is in his hands. Even with somewhat limited resources, he was there to show, I can still do something colossal. Never mind how many instruments I'm actually using at any one time. And he does it. No question. Brahms' first was an earth-shattering first symphony. And after Brahms, the Franck D minor, of course, his only symphony. The Franck D minor is important not just because of itself, because it's beautiful, incredibly beautiful, and sounds like absolutely nothing else written in the entire 19th century. It really doesn't. But because it founded the French symphonic school. No composer who came after Franck, who wrote symphonies in France, escaped the influence of the symphony in D minor. And not just because they trained with his student Dandy at the Schola Cantorum. It was because that became the French take on this most Germanic of art forms. And so the Franck Symphony in D minor is extremely important and just totally delicious all by itself. Number 7, Mahler 1. Is there any symphony, any first symphony after the Berlioz Symphony Fantastique that sounds so unlike everybody else and so completely characteristic of its composer? I mean, really. You put that thing on, and it's just, from the very first note, that octave, 8 octaves deep, that A in harmonics, and the dawn and the offstage trumpets and the folk-like melodies and the creepy funeral march with the Frere Jacques canon and the Jewish klezmer music and the Oompa bands. And I mean, there wasn't anything like that. Nothing even close that was, in any way comparable. As a first symphonic effort, it's right up there with the Berlioz as just an absolutely astonishing, independent and personal work, as well as a landmark in the aesthetics of what the symphony could be. Not a landmark that many in the day appreciated. Most were horrified by it, which makes it even more important and more enjoyable for us today. So there's that. Then Sibelius Kullervo, not the Sibelius First Symphony, because the first Sibelius Symphony was Kullervo. Absolutely, it was Kullervo. After this one, I'll go by the numbers. I mean, we have to take it both ways, don't we? We really do. The second symphony for Sibelius was the Lemminkainen Legends. That's a symphony too. And Sibelius referred to Kullervo and the Lemminkainen Legends as symphonies. He said, I really wrote 9, but only 7 of them have numbers. But in this particular case, I'm talking about Kullervo because it is unmistakably a piece where we hear that distinctive voice for the first time. And it's a work which absolutely no one else could have written. A fabulous work that has only in the past couple of decades come into its own and started to get performed regularly. You would think that finding a male chorus that can sing in Finnish is not the easiest thing in the world. But when you have a masterpiece, it's amazing what other foreign performing organizations can work up. I heard Spano do it with the Brooklyn Philharmonic, and I sat there with my friends from Helsinki who said they sounded just fine, and they did, and they weren't just being nice. Finnish people aren't like that. They'll tell you if it sucks. And I asked them if it sucked, and they said, no, they sounded really good, all things considered. So there you go. And Spano conducts, by the way, a great Kullervo. He recorded it for Telarc with the Atlanta Symphony, and it's splendid. So yeah, Kullervo is a first symphony of extraordinary promise and originality. What do we have next? Of course, Shostakovich Symphony No. 1. He was only 19 when he wrote it. Amazing. He was just 19, and it doesn't sound like anyone else. It's astonishing. Absolutely astonishing. You could not think any other composer than Shostakovich would have written that symphony. There are influences. We hear the influences, but they're within a context which is completely original. And it's not a wonder that that symphony was taken up by everybody as soon as he wrote it. I mean, Bruno Walter did it, Toscanini did it. Of course, all the Russian folks did it. It's amazing. Absolutely amazing. So Shostakovich Symphony No. 1. And last but not least, we're going to jump all the way up to the 1940s, because this, again, terribly underrated composer, terribly underrated symphony, neglected symphony. We don't hear it as often as it deserves to be heard. And that, my friends, is Martinu, Symphony No. 1. Now, he was quite a bit older when he wrote that, as were Franck and a bunch of other people who were Brahms, very late starting out as a symphonist. But the Martinu First Symphony has all of the qualities that I've just been talking about in First Symphonies. It is wholly original in its sound. You listen to the first 5 seconds, and if you know anything about Martinu, the composer, you know that this is Martinu. It could not possibly be by anybody else. It has a completely independent aesthetic perspective, especially in the 1940s when, the serial, interruption was interrupting at full force. And here he is writing a beautiful, luminous, tonal, wholly unique and original piece. And you can't say it's not cheap, it's not facile, it's none of those things. It's a masterpiece. An amazing piece of writing, and maybe one of the last great first symphonies in that tradition that I'm talking about. The idea of a composer making a wholly personal statement right out of the gate. And Martinu did that, and he was to continue doing that for the next 5 symphonies afterwards, which are all marvelous. We will be doing more talks about those pieces, just individually, so that we can grasp them a little bit more clearly, because they are amazing works and they deserve to be much better known. But for the purposes of this list, which is down below this review, so that you could just see the list easily, instead of having to worry about me pronouncing it, Martinu's First is the last, and by no means the least, of 10 great symphonies number 1. Numero uno. So let me see what your choices are. If you have some additions, or if you have totally independent lists, feel free to chime in with them. I'm very curious to see what you come up with, and we'll take it from there. Keep on listening, friends. I appreciate so much your joining me. Bye-bye.